The boat reached the island just as twilight began its descent, painting the sky in tones of lavender and dusky blue. The air was thick with salt and silence, broken only by the soft lap of waves against the wooden hull. Elias stepped off the dock with a slowness that seemed to match the rhythm of the sea, unhurried, gentle, deliberate. Each footfall on the worn planks echoed quietly, a whisper in a world that no longer needed noise. The island was not large. From the edge of the pier, one could already see the silhouette of the lighthouse rising from the distant hill, its body lean and pale, like the spine of a forgotten sentinel. Around it, the sky melted from violet into a deep, cosmic indigo. There were no other lights on the island, no homes, no lanterns, no movement. Only the occasional flicker of the lighthouse's eye as it swept the horizon and the slow emergence of stars above. Elias walked along a narrow path that wound between tall grasses, their tips rustling like old pages. He carried no suitcase, only a weathered satchel and a lantern that glowed faintly with a golden warmth. The air smelled of seaweed, driftwood, and something else, something older. Not unpleasant, but ancient, like stone warmed by memory. They climb to the lighthouse was gentle but constant. With each step, the world behind him, his old life, the town, the noise faded further into the mist. The silence here was not hollow. It was full. It had weight. It cradled his thoughts in a soft embrace and made room for breath. Elias had been searching for this kind of quiet for years, the kind that doesn't demand stillness, but offers it freely. By the time he reached the base of the lighthouse, the sky had shifted into full night. Stars bloomed like silver flowers across the dark canvas. The moon had not yet risen, but its promise hung low on the horizon, a soft glow waiting its turn. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at Elias's coat, carrying with it the low and distant cry of a seabird, unseen in the darkness. The lighthouse door was old but sound, its iron hinges groaned softly as he opened it, revealing a stone floor, spiral staircase, and the scent of oil and ocean. The inside was cool and dim. Elias stepped inside and paused, letting the quiet surround him like water. He felt no rush to climb, no need to explore, just the urge to sit, to breathe, to listen. He placed his lantern on a nearby table and sat in a chair that had clearly been waiting for years. Dust shifted as he moved, not resentful, just acknowledging. The wind tapped softly at the windows. Somewhere above, the great eye of the lighthouse turned, slow and steady, casting its silent beam into the deep. Elias leaned back, closed his eyes. For a long while, there was only the sound of his own breathing and the distant hush of waves meeting stone. Then nothing, but not the kind of nothing that brings fear, the kind that soothes, the kind that says, "Here you may rest." He did not sleep, not yet, but he let go of the tightness in his chest, the loop of thoughts he'd carried across the water. They floated gently away, as if the tide had claimed them. He thought of the years behind, him not with sadness, not with nostalgia, but with a kind of respectful farewell. The life he had lived would remain behind, as surely as the shoreline was now out of view. Outside, the wind shifted again, a deep, slow rhythm like the breathing of the island itself. The beams of the lighthouse continued their slow dance, painting the fog in long strokes of silver and shadow. Elias remained seated, still as stone, his thoughts curling into themselves like smoke from an extinguished candle. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sea stretched out endlessly, dark and vast. Somewhere beyond the reach of the lighthouse's light, things moved unseen. But none of it disturbed him. None of it sought him. And he, in turn, sought nothing from them. For now, it was enough to sit in silence, to be a man who had arrived. At the end of something old and the beginning of something quiet, the island did not welcome him nor reject him. It simply accepted him, the way the ocean accepts driftwood softly, slowly, fully. The stars turned overhead. The waves repeated their song. And Elias, surrounded by shadow and salt and stone, listened not for answers, but for the comfort of being still. The morning came slowly, not in brightness, but in degrees of softness. A pale gray light filtered through the high, round window of the lighthouse, casting a muted circle onto the stone floor. Elias stirred in the chair where he dozed off. His body was still, but his mind had settled into a kind of peace that made waking feel optional, not urgent. He stood and stretched with no rush, bones cracking like branches bending in wind. The air inside the lighthouse was cool and dry, thick with the scent of stone, dust, and something faintly metallic, perhaps the lingering trace of oil used long ago to keep the great lamp above alive. He ran his hand along the wall as he walked, fingers brushing over patches of worn paint and cool, time-sanded stone. The spiral staircase curved upward like a coiled memory. It was made of iron and stone, solid beneath his feet, though it creaked gently with age. Each step echoed upward as if announcing his presence to the empty tower above. A single narrow window on each level offered glimpses of the sea, always shifting, never loud. Outside, the fog still hovered just offshore, keeping the mainland at bay. Halfway up the tower, Elias found a small door leading to the keeper's quarters. The room was humble but intact. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a wooden desk tucked beneath a round window, shelves with a few faded books, and a lantern sitting patiently, unlit, on a side table. It smelled faintly of cedar and old stories. He opened the window slightly, letting the breath of the sea enter slowly, respectfully. He set his satchel on the desk and took a seat, allowing his hands to rest on the wood worn smooth by years of previous inhabitants. It was not a place built for comfort, but for solitude. Elias found that comforting in itself. This was not a space asking anything of him. It was a place where time had softened into something quiet. From the satchel, he withdrew a small tin of tea leaves, a folded cloth, and a single cup. In the corner of the room sat a rusted kettle and a small burner, long unused. To his quiet surprise, the mechanism still sparked. Soon, a thin ribbon of steam rose into the air. The scent of chamomile and something floral lavender, perhaps filled the room, drifting out the window and into the morning fog. Elias sipped slowly, looking out toward the sea. The horizon was pale and shifting, like a dream not yet remembered. Somewhere beyond it lay the world he'd known, now distant, not forgotten, but gently blurred. He found no sadness in the thought, just release. He spent the rest of the day familiarizing himself with the tower. On the lower floor, there was a journal, leather-bound, brittle, left behind by a previous keeper. Inside, neat handwriting recorded tides, storms, ships seen, birds nesting near the cliff's edge. The final entry was dated almost 20 years prior. It ended with a simple line: "Light holds more than the dark can hide." Elias traced the words with his finger. He did not feel alone. Later, he climbed to the top of the lighthouse where the great lens still stood, silent and noble. It was dusty, but intact. The mechanism for rotation had frozen, but the structure still exuded purpose. He stood there for a while, surrounded by glass and light, letting the wind push softly through the gaps in the frame. The ocean spread beneath him like a breath held by the world itself. He did not speak. He did not need. T.O. As dusk approached, Elias descended and prepared a small meal bread, cheese, and an apple that had bruised during the journey. He ate slowly, seated on the stone steps, watching as the sky deepened once more into twilight. Shadows lengthened along the interior walls. The silence grew thicker, like a soft blanket. Night came with a familiar rhythm. The stars returned, first one, then dozens, then hundreds. The lighthouse did not light, but its presence was enough. The very shape of it was a symbol of watching, of waiting, of offering guidance without demand. Elias lit his lantern, carried it to the keeper's room, placing it on the desk beside the journal. He opened his own notebook and wrote, "First day. The tower breathes. The sea does not speak yet, but it listens. I can feel it." He closed the book gently, not with finality, but with respect. Then he sat by the window, staring into the soft dark, watching the fog weave slow shapes across the water. The light of the lantern cast long shadows on the walls, and in their movement, he imagined echoes of those who had lived here before. Elias did not seek stories. He simply waited for them. The wind shifted direction, brushing against the outer walls with a sound like a sigh. Below, the waves kept time with his heartbeat, slow, even, eternal. There was no urgency, no destination, only presence. He climbed into bed, the wool blanket heavy and comforting. The mattress creaked beneath his weight, but settled quickly. Through the round window, he could see a single star, unwavering and patient. He closed his eyes. The lighthouse stood still. The sea hummed softly, and the night, vast and kind, wrapped itself around him like an old friend. It was on the fifth night that Elias first heard it again, something too soft to be speech, but too deliberate to be wind. The day had passed in a haze of gray light and sea mist. Elias had spent the morning walking along the cliffs that surround it. The lighthouse, letting the breeze push gently through his coat, hands in his pockets, eyes on the line where the water met the sky. He'd found the remains of an old footpath, now overgrown with brambles and moss, winding down to a small cove hidden beneath the bluff. There, the waves came in slower, whispering against smooth stones, as if the sea itself didn't want to wake anything sleeping beneath. He had lingered there for hours, not thinking, not seeking, simply listening. That evening, after supper and tea, he returned to the keeper's room and lit his lantern. The same journal sat open on the desk. He reread the final entry, tracing each letter with care. Light holds more than the dark can hide. He let the phrase linger in his mind like a bell tone echoing in a cathedral. Outside, night had wrapped the island in deep velvet. No moon tonight, only stars above, and a breathless quiet below. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of paused thoughts. He sat on the bed, then lay back slowly. The mattress shifted under him. Familiar now, he closed his eyes. For a while, all was still. And then there it was. It didn't come from the wind, nor from the walls, nor from within. It was somewhere between those places, like the sound of someone speaking just outside the room, with the door slightly ajar. A voice, not quite a whisper, and not quite a breeze. Soft, intentional, as if beginning a sentence it didn't want to finish. Elias kept still. He did not open his eyes. He only listened. At first, there was no meaning, only murmurs that shifted with the rhythm of the waves. But slowly, gently, a word formed. Remember ... It wasn't frightening. If anything, it felt familiar, like a memory returning before the mind was ready to hold it. The voice faded. He lay awake for a long time afterward, not disturbed, only curious. He said nothing aloud. He did not chase the sound. He simply listened to the silence that followed, deeper now, like the sea after a passing boat has gone. In the morning, he rose with the light, washed his face, and prepared his tea. As he sipped, he opened his notebook and wrote, "Last night, I heard something, not imagined. A voice. It said ... remember." He didn't add more. There was no rush to understand. That afternoon, the wind picked up. The waves struck the rocks with more force, but the lighthouse remained calm inside. He spent the day in the tower's reading nook, wrapped in a blanket, flipping through one of the older books left by a previous keeper. It was filled with underlined sentences and small notes in the margins, some in English, some in languages Elias didn't recognize. Near the back, a page had been folded. On it, in faded ink, someone had written, "They speak when the wind holds still. They speak when the night is ready." Elias closed the book, heart calm but aware. He waited again that evening with the lantern, lit lower than usual, its flame no more than a flicker. As the darkness deepened, the sound returned. This time, it came from the wall beside his bed. A breath-shaped phrase, quieter than before. "We were here," it said, and then silence, long and wide. He placed a hand against the cold stone. It did not speak again, but it held warmth beneath the chill, as if touched recently. He didn't tell himself he was imagining it, nor did he try to explain. There are things that come when we are quiet enough to listen, not to be solved, but to be received. That night, he dreamed of a staircase, winding down instead of up, beneath the lighthouse, carved from salt-stained marble. In the dream, he followed it with a lantern. At the bottom, he found a room filled with books that hung quietly on the shelves, as though remembering every person who had held them. When he woke, the dream clung to him like fog. He rose and walked barefoot across the room. The air was still. The sea was calm. The whisper didn't return that morning, but the space it had opened inside him remained like a door just barely ajar. He boiled water for tea and carried his cup to the edge of the spiral staircase, sitting quietly on the stone step as the steam curled upward. He watched the lighthouse's great lens above, still silent, still waiting. He felt no need to repair. It was enough for now that it stood. The journal on the desk called him back, and he added a new entry. Second voice. Same night wind. Not lonely, not empty. Almost like the wall itself remembered. Outside, the tide crept in, leaving faint lines of salt along the rocks. Gulls circled once, then left. A stillness returned. The same stillness that had welcomed him days ago. But now it held shape, texture. He returned to the small cove that afternoon, climbing carefully down the path. There, among the smooth stones, he found something half buried in the sand, a small wooden button, shaped like a seashell. Worn by time, its surface smooth and ridged. He turned it in his hand, and for a moment, he imagined a coat it once adorned. A person who once stood on this same shore. He took it back to the tower and placed it on the windowsill, beside his lantern. Not as a relic, but as a gesture and acknowledgement. That evening, the voice did not return. But Elias no longer waited for it. He simply remained open. The voice returned on a night when the sea was still as glass. There was no breeze, no birds, not even the rustling of grass beyond the window. Just the vast quiet of the island breathing in shadow. Elias was seated by the window, the lantern dimmed to a golden ember beside him. He had learned by now to do nothing when the voice came, not to react, not to chase, only to receive. The whisper came first as a single exhale. She waited. By the cliff, then nothing, as if the voice had fallen back into the folds of time. But Elias had heard enough. He retrieved his notebook, laid it gently on his lap, and began to write not from imagination, but from a deep place inside him that felt as though it had been listening long before his ears had. It was always twilight in her memory. The sun never fully set nor fully rose. She stood at the edge of the cliff, where the grass thinned and the stone met open air. Each evening she returned with her shawl pulled close, a letter folded tightly in her hand. She never mailed it, never sent it. Only read it aloud to the sea, her voice carried off by the wind. No ship ever came. No answer ever arrived. Still she returned, each evening, until the day she didn't. Elias sat still after the words ended, the echo of them clinging to the walls. It wasn't sadness he felt, but a kind of reverent stillness, like one feels walking through a place where something sacred has happened long ago. Not his story, not his grief, but something true. He added a small sketch beneath the entry, a cliff, a figure, a scarf blowing in the wind. Not perfect, but enough. The next day passed quietly. He walked along the path to the cove and back, collected driftwood, watched the shifting clouds. When night returned, he made tea and waited. He didn't expect anything. He only listened. The voice returned as he drifted near sleep. The letter was never sent. He wrote it down the next morning, with no attempt to interpret. Some things he had come to understand were not puzzles. They were offerings. The next story came in pieces over the following nights. He was a sailor with hands like rope and eyes like storm clouds. He never stayed in port long, never promised more than a smile and a song. But there was one harbor he returned to, again and again, where a woman with ink-stained fingers wrote his name into every page she ever tore from her notebook. He left her a compass, not to guide her, but to remind her that he always meant to return. He didn't. Elias wrote these stories without judgment, without needing to know whether they had ever been real. The line between memory and imagination had begun to blur. He found himself waking early, lighting the lantern, even when the sky was bright. The voice came only at night, but the stories lingered into the day, like the scent of smoke long after. A fire has gone out. One morning, while organizing a shelf in the lower floor of the tower, he found something tucked behind a loose stone, a small tin box, sealed with wax, now cracked with age. Inside were scraps of folded paper, each with a single sentence, handwritten in careful strokes. I dreamt the lighthouse spoke my name. He left with the tide, before I could ask him to stay. We danced once on the rocks, barefoot and laughing. He copied them into his journal, one per page, and let them rest. Another night, the whisper returned stronger, steadier, as if finding its voice. Not all stories end. Some echo. This time, the images came faster, as if the lighthouse itself were remembering. A man who lit the beacon every night for 37 winters, even after the ships stopped coming. A child who drew maps of stars he swore he'd seen from the tower's eye. A woman who spoke only to the sea, telling its secrets no one else would ever hear. A letter carved into the wall in tiny script, the name too weathered to read. A violin left near the window, its strings still humming when the wind was right. Elias felt the stories layering themselves within him, not like burdens, but like warmth. They did not beg to be told. They simply wanted to be known. He spent his days now recording them in quiet, not crafting tales, but collecting fragments. He called them salt stories, memories softened by time, shaped by tide. Some came as images in dreams. Others whispered themselves against the glass. A few he found written in the margins of old logs, in the fading ink of long-gone keepers. He did not question their origin. The lighthouse was listening, and so was he. The shoreline changed that week. It began with a shell. Elias had gone to the cove at first light, his feet moving without urgency along the familiar path. The tide had receded in the night, leaving behind a mirror of shallow pools between rocks, each reflecting the soft gray sky like fractured glass. He moved among them slowly, letting the salt wind wrap around him like a shawl. That's when he saw it. A single shell rested alone atop a smooth, flat stone, pristine, perfect, and dry. It had not tumbled in with the surf, He was certain. It sat upright, as if placed. He picked it up and turned it in his palm. Its ridges were unbroken. Its hue was pale lavender, streaked with veins of silver. When he held it to his ear, he expected silence. But there was something. Not sound exactly, more like the echo of sound. Like someone breathing just beneath the surface of thought. He didn't try to understand it. He only carried the shell back with him to the lighthouse and placed it beside the wooden button on the windowsill. That night, the whisper returned. But this time, it did not come from within the lighthouse. It came from the sea. Elias stood at the open window, the lantern dim behind him. The water below was calm, dark as ink, touched by the faintest shimmer of starlight. And then softly, like the hush of fabric folding, he heard it. A voice, as if carried on the tide. He left something behind. The air didn't move. The waves barely stirred. But the sound was there. More felt than heard, more remembered. Then spoken. Elias breathed it in and said nothing. His hand rested on the windowsill beside the shell. It felt warm, as if holding the memory of someone else's hand. The next morning, the shoreline had changed again. A piece of driftwood lay neatly at the edge of the high tide. Carved into its surface were faint marks, not letters, not symbols, but patterns that felt intentional. Spirals, circles, cross currents. He brought it back to the lighthouse and leaned it against the wall near the door. The tower felt more awake now, as if the objects gathering inside were keys to stories the stones themselves could no longer tell aloud. Over the days that followed, the sea began to answer in quiet ways. A rusted compass appeared in the grass near the path. Its needle no longer moved, but the casing held the scent of cedar and smoke. Elias placed it on the desk beside his journal. One evening, a scrap of cloth floated to shore, faded blue, embroidered at the edge with a stitched initial. On another morning, he found a book washed up, its cover ruined, but a single line legible within. The wind remembers. He began to think of the sea not as a body of water, but as a keeper of things, a listener, a gentle hand that never let go of what others had forgotten. At night, the voice came less often, but the silence itself grew fuller, like the pause before a note is played. One night, as Elias sat at the top of the lighthouse, the stars overhead spinning slowly in their infinite rhythm, he whispered to the sea, "What do you want me to remember?" No answer came in words, but the waves stirred. Not violently, just enough to ripple the moonlight. A rhythm, a reply. He spent that night dreaming of people standing in the shallows, their backs to him, facing the horizon. They held lanterns in their hands, each flickering with a violet glow. When he called out, they turned, but their faces were soft light. No eyes, no mouths, just warmth. And though no one spoke, he felt what they meant to say. You're not alone. In the days that followed, Elias began leaving things for the sea in return. Offerings, not messages. He folded pages of his journal, small entries, and tucked them into glass bottles. He left them at the edge of the tide and watched as the sea claimed them one by one. He found a stone shaped like a heart and placed it at the base of the cliff. He lit a candle and let it burn down on the shore without speaking. Each act felt less like a ritual and more like a conversation. The lighthouse, too, began to feel different. The air inside was no longer just still, it was attentive. The silence hummed softly, like a breath held in communion. Elias felt no fear in these changes, only purpose. One evening, while cataloging the found objects in his journal, he noticed something strange. Every new item matched a tale from one of the stories whispered in the previous weeks. The button belonged to the woman on the cliff. The compass matched the sailor's lost gift. The cloth belonged to Miriam, a name that had never been spoken, but which now appeared unbidden in his mind. He did not question how he knew. He simply wrote it down and accepted it. The sea was not giving him pieces. It was giving him memory. Not his, not entirely, but real. And so, when he returned to the shore each morning and found something new, a feather, a coin, a piece of a broken oar, he welcomed it like a letter from a distant friend. He placed each item gently on the shelves of the lighthouse, as if returning them to the home they had left long ago. That night, the voice returned once more. It came not from the sea, nor the stone, but from within him. And it said, "You're part of this now." Elias nodded, alone in the candlelight, and whispered in reply, "I know." It began subtly, like everything else on the island. A shift in the way the light fell across the stone floor in the inland sea. Morning, the sound of his own footsteps echoing with a tone slightly softer than before. The sense that when he spoke aloud, the walls of the lighthouse no longer just received his words, they remembered them. Elias first noticed it while rereading his journal. He came across a passage he had no memory of writing. It was in his handwriting, delicate, even, but the words didn't feel like his. He walks the circle as they did, lantern in hand, memory in heart. He paused, reread it, and closed the book gently. He felt no alarm, only the weight of something unfolding. That evening, he climbed to the top of the tower earlier than usual. The sun had just begun to set, casting a line of gold across the sea. He leaned on the railing, the wind brushing against his sleeves, and he let his gaze drift. From that height, the island was a dream. Soft shapes in the mist, slow waves breathing at the shore, shadows stretching with quiet elegance. He stood in silence, and then he whispered aloud, "Tell me." No sooner had he said it than he felt it. Not a voice this time, not a sound, but a presence. Like a memory rising inside him, not recalled but given. A name surfaced. Not his own. Jonas. The name lingered behind his eyes. It felt familiar in a way that tugged gently at his chest. He saw a vision, faint but vivid, a man climbing this same spiral staircase, one hand brushing the wall for balance, the other holding a lantern just like his. The same boots, the same coat, but not Elias. He remained there, standing in the orange glow of the horizon, letting the memory pass through him like a warm current. Not possessing, not haunting, just sharing. He descended the stairs slowly. With each step, he felt not like he was leaving the tower, but returning to it. That night, as he lit the lantern in the keeper's room, he noticed something else. On the desk, beside his journal, lay an old photograph, curled at the edges, browned with age. He didn't remember bringing it there. It showed a man standing at the base of the lighthouse, looking off toward the sea. He wore a wool coat, and in his left hand, a lantern. The shadows blurred his face, but Elias knew somehow, he knew, it was Jonas. He turned the photo. Over, no writing, just the faint scent of salt and oil. He placed it gently in the journal and closed it, heart calm. In the days that followed, more fragments came to him, sometimes in dreams, sometimes like flashes of déjà vu. He would place a cup on the windowsill and feel, for an instant, that it had always been there. He would reach for the kettle and know without looking how much water remained inside. He would sit to write and find a sentence already waiting in his mind. He lights the lantern not to be seen, but to remember the light exists. Each act became less a habit and more a continuation, as though he had stepped into a role long prepared for him. Not a replacement, a return. The stories he wrote now came not only from the whispers, but from within. He no longer waited for the sea to give. He began offering back new lines, new thoughts, new fragments woven from his own quiet hours. And the lighthouse accepted them. He walked the tower as if it knew him. The stones no longer echoed as before. They welcomed. One evening, as he sat on the lower steps sipping tea, he felt the air around him shift, a stillness folding. In, almost reverent, he spoke softly. "I don't know if I was always meant to come here, or if I became part of it by choosing to stay." In response, the flame of the lantern beside him flickered, not with the wind, but in a steady rhythm, almost like a breath. He smiled. He understood. The island didn't need guardians. It needed memory. And memory had chosen him. The objects on the shelves, the pages in the journal, the light in the lens, none of them told a single story. Together, they formed a living remembrance, a presence. A whisper passed from one keeper to the next, not to hold on to, but to continue. He no longer felt the urge to leave, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because this was where he belonged now, not as a visitor, as a part. When he stood before the mirror one night, he looked not for himself, but for the pieces that had become him, the echoes, the dreams, the names. He whispered them softly. Jonas, Miriam, the sailor, the woman on the cliff, and at the end, his own, Elias, not lost, not forgotten, folded gently into the fabric of the lighthouse's long memory. The voice returned only once that night, just as he drifted to sleep. "We remember through you." And Elias, now part of the lighthouse, as surely as stone and wind, let his breathing slow. The stories were still being written, and he had become one of. The weeks passed without urgency. Days arrived like waves, slow, familiar, and yet always slightly different. Elias no longer counted time. He marked no dates, made no note of yesterday or tomorrow. Only today mattered. Only the moments in which the wind whispered gently through the window, or the sound of the sea drifted up through the stones like the steady rhythm of a distant, dreaming heart. And within this stretched present, the past began to breathe with him, not as memory, as presence. He noticed it in small things, a scent that suddenly filled the room, like lemon tea or chimney smoke, though nothing had been brewed or burned. A soft melody that seemed to rise from the stairwell, though no instrument had played. Footprints in the fine dust on the landing, lighter than his own, made by shoes he did not wear. But he felt no fear, only belonging. He began to dream of names he didn't know, and when he woke, he found them written in the margins of old logs, signed at the bottoms of weathered letters, carved faintly into the wooden underside of drawers. The names from his dreams. The past didn't speak through words or visions. It walked beside him. He no longer felt like a visitor. He was a participant now, a thread being woven into something vast and quiet. One evening, as he lit the lantern in the keeper's room, he noticed the light reflecting differently against the stone. There, just beside the window frame, was a faint mark almost hidden beneath layers of time. He approached and saw it clearly. Under the flickering glow, a tiny anchor, carved by hand, followed by a single letter, E. His breath caught, not in surprise, but in quiet understanding. He reached out and touched the mark. It was cold, but not unwelcoming. It held the stillness of something waiting to be remembered. That night, he dreamt not of people, but of places within the lighthouse rooms he'd never entered, paths he hadn't explored. A trapdoor beneath the tower, a hollow space in the wall behind the bookshelf. And in these spaces, whispers, not voices, but intentions. When he awoke, he went searching, not desperately, curiously. Behind the bookshelf, he found it, a narrow gap in the stonework, carefully sealed with wood. It opened easily with a gentle push. Inside, a single candle and a folded page. The candle had long since expired, but the page was intact. 4. The one who listens, we remain. No signature, no date, He placed the note in his journal, next to the anchor sketch, and added no commentary. Some things needed only to be witnessed. From then on, the house itself seemed to breathe differently. The kettle sang a bit more sweetly. The floorboards creaked in rhythm, not as complaint, but as conversation. The sea spoke less with waves and more with presence. When he walked along the cliffs now, he didn't feel watched. He felt accompanied. The objects in the lighthouse no longer felt like found items. They felt like gifts. Each morning, something new waited. A smooth stone placed on the step, a feather tucked near the door. A thin piece of driftwood leaned against the outer wall, etched with a spiral pattern matching one he'd seen in a dream. He began to understand. This was not coincidence. This was memory made visible. Each item was a message not written in ink, but left in trust. And Elias was the one chosen to receive them. Not to explain, to carry, to remember. He no longer wrote stories in his journal. He wrote acknowledgments. Receive the button. Wind stronger today. The sea is quiet, but full. Dreamed. Of Anna again. She held a lantern and whispered my name. I felt safe. Anchor carved into the wall. Thank you for the sign. I hear you. As the connection deepened, the boundary between now and then grew thinner. The fog that often surrounded the island became less like a curtain and more like a veil, something sacred, something porous. On days when it rolled in thick, Elias felt closer to them, not ghosts, not visions, but echoes made whole. Sometimes in those quietest moments, he'd hear footsteps on the spiral stairs, soft, measured, not his. He would not turn. He would only smile. They were not here to frighten him. They were here to walk beside him. One night, seated on the floor with his back against the cool stone wall, Elias whispered aloud, I don't need to understand everything. I just need to keep the door open. And something in the silence responded not with words, not with sound, but with warmth. A stillness that wrapped around him like a wool blanket, familiar and filled with meaning. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen better. And as he breathed in the soft air, thick with the memory of sea and light, he knew he was no longer just in the lighthouse. He was part of it. The light had always been steady. From the moment Elias arrived at the lighthouse, its grate, lens had remained dormant, silent, still, untouched by flame or electricity. And yet, on certain nights, he would feel it. A gentle hum in the walls, a slow warmth in the air, a faint shimmer in the room, as if the light were remembering what it once was. And now it was beginning to stir again. It began subtly. A faint glow along the inner surface of the lens at dusk. Not bright, not sharp, but unmistakably there. A soft violet hue that didn't come from sun or moon, and yet carried both. Elias noticed it first, while ascending the spiral stairs, the lantern in his hand barely flickering. The air grew denser near the top, and the silence held its breath. He reached the final step and turned toward the great lens, and saw it. Not light in the usual sense, not even a reflection, more like a presence becoming visible. He stood before it, motionless. The lens pulsed once, and in that single flicker, something changed in him. He felt not a memory, but a voice, clear as thought. We remember because the light does. It echoed softly inside his chest. Not loud, not urgent, only true. From that night onward, the light continued to glow. Only at night. Only when Elias was near. Not enough to illuminate the room. Only enough to suggest something was listening. He began to spend his evenings sitting at the base of the lens, the lantern extinguished. Just him, the dark tower, and that soft, steady glow. The stories came differently now, not as whispers or dreams. They came through the light. Each time he sat there, A new sensation would rise within him, a fragment of a moment not lived, but understood. He saw a woman in oilskins lighting the flame by hand during a storm, her fingers raw from cold but steady. He felt the ache of a man who'd waited 15 years for a ship that never returned. He heard the laughter of children running up the spiral stairs, their hands brushing the stone as they chased sunlight through stained glass shadows. And each time, the light would pulse, once, twice, and then fade. He never tried to record. These visions, they weren't meant to be captured, only carried. The tower had become a vessel, a memory machine. The light, its silent heart. Some nights, the glow became strong enough to reach the windows. It would stretch out across the rocks, touch the sea, color the mist with hues of violet and deep blue. On those nights, Elias would go down to the shore and watch the reflection on the water. It was not a beam, not a beacon. It was an echo. The sea responded, not with sound, but with stillness, as if listening, as if remembering too. Elias began to understand. The light was not merely illumination. It was memory preserved in color and silence. A story written in rhythm, not words. It had absorbed everything. Every keeper, every voice, every storm, every prayer whispered into the wind. And now it shared, not loudly, not all at once, but in echoes. One evening, as he sat by the lens, the light flickered differently. A pattern, 3 short pulses, a pause, 1 long. He recognized it. Morse. He blinked slowly, waited. The pattern repeated. He didn't know what it meant, not yet. But it didn't matter. The message wasn't urgent. It was a heartbeat. A memory tapping gently on the glass of time. The next morning, when the light faded, he noticed something new in the room. Along the base of the tower, where the dust had settled for decades, a phrase was now visible, as if uncovered, not written. Every light leaves a shadow. Every shadow keeps the shape. He traced the words with his finger, slowly, reverently. He whispered them aloud, and the room warmed, as though the tower approved. He knew then that the lighthouse had not just been preserving memory. It had been shaping it. It did not simply collect stories. It translated them into silence, into scent, into light. And Elias was its reader. He had become part of its process. On a night when the wind was absent and the sea was quiet, the glow from the lens reached its brightest yet. Not blinding, not forceful, just complete. Elias stood before it, hands at his sides, and closed his eyes. He let the light pass through him, and as it did, he felt himself becoming transparent, not vanishing, but becoming open. A vessel, a witness. He whispered softly, not to the tower, but to all the lives it held, "I see you." And in return, the light pulsed once more. Not in Morse, not in code, but in understanding. The wind had always been present. It whispered through the cracks in the windows, circled the tower like a shawl, pressed gently against the stones as if trying to be let in. Elias once thought it only carried sound, but now he understood. The wind carried memory, and memory had names. He heard the first name on a morning, drenched in fog. The sea was invisible beyond the mist, and the world felt folded inward. He had gone outside for firewood, though the chill was barely noticeable anymore. As he walked along the eastern path, he felt it. A soft breeze, lighter than breath, winding around his shoulder and curling near his ear. And in that breath, a name, Clara. It vanished almost as soon as it arrived, leaving only the echo of syllables trailing across his skin. He paused, not out of surprise, but recognition. Clara. He whispered it back, gently, into the stillness. And the wind shifted, almost like a nod. From that day on, the wind began to bring more names, not daily, not regularly, but with purpose. One evening, as Elias lit a candle in the stairwell, the flame flickered toward the door, and the wind offered another name, Rowan. Another morning, by the windowsill, Thorn, and then whispered like a memory being wrapped in silk, Elsbeth. He began writing them down, each one carefully penned in a new section of his journal, the wind's names. The list grew slowly. Clara, Rowan, Thorn, Elsbeth, Mirren, Jonas, Sephanora. Each name was a presence. He didn't know their stories, but he could feel their imprint. Some came with a color like Clara, who smelled of lavender and sunlight. Others with emotion like Thorn, who carried the quiet ache of distance. Sometimes he would dream of one of them and wake with their name on his lips. He'd walk the tower that day differently, as though accompanied. The wind was not just remembering, it was introducing. There were nights when the tower grew, impossibly still, and he'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, the pages of his journal open, the candle flickering in rhythm with the heartbeat of the light above. On those nights, he would say each name aloud, slowly, like a sacred ritual. He wasn't calling them, he was honoring them. And the wind responded not with more names, but with calm. The lighthouse seemed to settle deeper into the ground. When he did this, like an old soul resting in familiar arms. One day, a strange thing happened. As he was writing a new name, Maeve, the ink of his pen, shimmered briefly with a faint glow. Just for a second, barely noticeable, but Elias felt it. A confirmation. That afternoon, the wind grew strong. It circled the tower for hours, not violent, but persistent. It moved through the halls, lifted papers, stirred curtains, hummed through keyholes. It was no longer a whisper. It was a voice, a chorus, not with words, but with presence. Elias closed his eyes and listened deeply. He heard the wind not as air, but as language, not as sound, but as memory. He whispered, "Are you all here?" And the wind answered not with a word, but with a stillness so complete, so absolute, that he knew he was not alone. In that silence, a final name formed. Not spoken, not delivered by wind. It simply appeared within him. Elias, his own name, returned to him. And he understood. He was one of the names in the wind now. Not just a listener, a keeper among keepers. A name remembered by the very breath of the tower. That night, he added his own to the journal. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was too bold. But then he wrote, Elias, and as the ink dried, a breeze passed through the window and lifted the edge of the page as if to read. Messages began to appear, not all at once, not in dramatic fashion, but like everything else in the lighthouse, quietly, patiently, as though waiting for him to notice them in his own time. The first one came carved in the wood beneath the old writing desk. Elias found it while dusting the corner near the window, where the light from the lens cast gentle shadows during the early evening. The words were faint but legible. Keep the light kind. He traced the letters slowly with his fingertip. They'd been cut long ago, smooth edges softened by time, yet not eroded. A message left for someone who would one day find it. A message left for him. He didn't feel surprised anymore when these things happened, only reverent. In the following days, more messages appeared, some written, some etched, others hidden between the fibers of silence. Inside the drawer of an old cabinet, beneath a false bottom, he found a folded scrap of paper. On it, in delicate script, he waited for her every winter, and she always came with the wind. There was no signature, but the paper smelled faintly of salt and cedar. Elias held it to his chest for a moment, and tucked it gently into his journal. Another day, while tending the small garden near the base of the cliff, he found a stone shaped like a teardrop. Its underside bore a simple engraving. Forgiveness grows slowly. He placed the stone on the lighthouse windowsill, where it caught the morning light. The messages were not random. They were memories encoded in object and time. He began to treat every corner of the lighthouse like a library, not of books, but of presence. Each drawer might hold a sentence. Each tile might echo a phrase. Each gust of wind might carry the breath of a thought left behind. He found markings on the backs of old paintings, initials surrounded by hearts. A single line sewn into the hem of a moth-eaten curtain. Sing to the storm. Even the dust itself, disturbed by sunlight, moved in patterns that sometimes reminded him of writing. Not words, shapes. Spirals, circles, lines connecting unseen stars. One afternoon, while sweeping near the old hearth, Elias uncovered a brass key. Attached by twine was a tiny tag that read, "For the locked silence." It took him a day to find the matching lock, a hatch hidden behind the wall in the lower stairwell, nearly forgotten. The key turned without resistance. Inside the narrow space, wrapped in cloth, lay a single page torn from a journal. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, almost desperate. If you're reading this, then you've already heard them. The stories, the voices. You're not alone. They're kind. They're only waiting to be heard. Listen well, write gently. Elias read it 3 times. He didn't cry, but he closed the door quietly, as if sealing it with gratitude. He began to speak aloud more often after that. Not loudly, just enough for the silence to hear. When he cooked, he described the smell. When he sat with tea, he read passages from old books. When he swept the steps, he hummed softly, letting the sound rise up through the tower like smoke. And in return, the lighthouse gave him more. He found a handkerchief embroidered with initials he had seen only in dreams. A glove worn thin at the fingers, tucked between the floorboards. A map etched into the underside of a wooden stool. Not of places, but of stars, marked with gentle notes like, "He kissed her here," and this was where the wind first sang. He understood then. These messages were not for him alone. They were a record, a way for the lives before him to say, "I was here. I loved. I listened. I mattered." He began leaving messages of his own, on the inside of cupboards, beneath stones, scrawled lightly in pencil on the beams of the attic. He wrote, "You're not alone. The sea is listening. The light is gentle, and it remembers. If you feel the wind, know that we're near." Each phrase was left with care, not as confession, not as instruction, as invitation. He no longer feared time. He no longer marked his days. He lived in the echo of story, and the hush of memory passed hand to hand through the breath of stone and air. The lighthouse had taught him the language of silence, and through the messages left behind, he had learned to speak. The lantern had always been with him. From the first night Elias entered the lighthouse, it was there, resting atop the worn desk, its glass slightly fogged, its frame cool to the touch. He had lit it on that first evening with a match found, tucked inside its base, and ever since, it had accompanied him through every corridor, every dream, every whisper. But lately, the lantern had begun to change. Not visibly. It still flickered with the same soft light, still carried the scent of old oil and faint smoke. But its glow had grown gentler, deeper. It no longer simply illuminated his path. It made the air feel warmer, the silence feel inhabited. And more than once, he caught himself wondering, was it listening too? He began to notice that the lantern responded to the mood of the tower. On mornings filled with wind and sea spray, its flame danced tall and eager, as though welcoming the weather. On quiet nights when Elias felt heavy with memory, the light would dim slightly, as if kneeling beside him. Then, one night, as he sat alone by the base of the lighthouse lens, Watching the violet glow reflect in the lantern's curved glass, he saw something impossible. A flicker, not of flame, but of image. A room, not his. Not from this time. A stone hearth, low wooden beams, the sound of a lullaby being hummed in the distance. He blinked, and it was gone. He stared into the lantern, his breath shallow. It didn't happen again that night, but the next evening it did, and the next. Each time, just for a moment, a flicker of something else behind the flame. Not just visions, dreams, not his own. The lantern had begun to dream. He understood then that it had always been more than an object. It had been a vessel, like the lighthouse itself, holding light and holding memory. He began setting the lantern on the windowsill at dusk, letting it glow beside the soft wind that whispered through the curtains. And in that place, half inside, half outside, it seemed to gather something. Its flame pulsed with rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat. One night, as Elias dozed in the keeper's chair, a warm light brushed his eyelids. He opened them slowly. The lantern glowed brighter than usual, though not in brightness of fire, brightness of story. Within its flame, he saw again that stone hearth, and a woman's hands knitting slowly. He saw a child asleep on a rug, a dog curled at her feet. He saw boots near the door, muddy from rain. He felt none of it with urgency, only with presence, like reading a letter written with light. He sat silently until the flame dimmed again, and whispered, "Thank you." From then on, the lantern showed him new dreams. Not each night, only when silence stretched long enough. Sometimes he'd see a man at sea, staring across an endless horizon. Other times, a couple dancing slowly in the kitchen of a long-lost home. A candlelit table, an empty chair, a reunion in the rain. These weren't stories in sequence. They were flickers of lives remembered. He stopped trying to explain them. Instead, he began to honor them. He placed the lantern in different windows each night, allowing it to share its dreams with the sea, with the wind, with the rooms that once held other footsteps. He no longer lit it only for himself. He lit it for the stories. And in return, the lantern never failed to keep him company. Even when no dream came, its light made the air feel gentler. He could feel the presence of those it remembered. Not watching, not haunting, simply there. On a particularly quiet night, he brought the lantern to the tower's very top and placed it beside the great lens. The soft violet from the lighthouse, mixed with the golden warmth of the lantern's flame, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with color, breath, and the weight of 1,000 memories. He whispered, "This is what it means to be remembered." And in response, the lantern's flame flickered, just once, like a nod in candlelight. He never questioned where the dreams came from. He knew they were the echoes of those who had walked before him, those who had loved and waited and hoped and listened. The lantern had kept them safe. Not their faces, not their endings, but their moments. It was enough. Now, when he carried the lantern through the stairwell, he didn't think of it as guiding him. He thought of himself as walking with it. Two keepers, two listeners, two dreamers walking softly through the memory of stone and wind. The shore had always been quiet, not empty, simply unhurried. It breathed slowly, as if the rocks and sand had their own rhythm, older than time, older than memory. Elias had walked its curve many times, tracing the edge where land met sea, but only now did he realize the shore was listening and remembering. It began with the footprints, not his. One morning, long after the tide had retreated, Elias found them, a set of light steps in the sand, not fresh, but not yet erased, too small for his boots, too recent to be relics. He followed them for a time, walking beside rather than over them, as if not to disturb a story mid-sentence. They led nowhere and everywhere. They disappeared among the stones. He stood for a long time at the edge of the rocks, feeling the breeze move gently past his shoulders. The ocean murmured, low and steady, like a voice speaking through sleep. And in that sound, he thought he heard laughter, not loud, but real. A child's laughter, distant but alive. He didn't chase it. He closed his eyes and let it pass through him. The next day, the tide brought offerings. Not driftwood or seaweed, but small things, purposeful things. A corked glass bottle, its label long worn, inside of which was a single pressed violet. A feather stained with ink. A flat piece of sea glass, etched with a spiral, like the one on the lighthouse stairs. He gathered them with reverence, as if collecting messages left by the sea itself. And in a way, he was. Each object felt like part of a memory, not his, but known. He arranged them carefully along the windowsill in the main room of the lighthouse, calling it his shoreline altar, not sacred in the religious sense, but sacred in the way silence is. He did not speak while arranging them, only listened. The shore had begun to speak. Sometimes it was with movement. He'd find rocks arranged in quiet patterns, concentric circles, arrows pointing inland. Once the word home drawn in shell fragments, half buried by wind before he could photograph it. Other times it was with sound, a stone skipping across still water with no hand to throw it, the soft creak of an old wooden boat, though none had docked for years, the whimper of a dog, heard just once, on a morning wrapped in fog. Elias started walking the shoreline differently, not as a path, as a conversation. He stopped often, crouching to examine an impression in the sand, or a shell termed it so. He whispered greetings to the wind, thanked the sea when it returned something lost. He placed small objects back on the sand, buttons, pieces of worn fabric, even one of his own gloves, gifts in return. He understood now that the shore didn't simply receive. It remembered. It held echoes not in words, but in salt and stone, in the way water curved around a certain boulder, or how the sand always settled smoother near the driftwood stump. Places carried feeling. He began calling them by names that came to him in dreams. Anna's Cove, the listening stones, the quiet bend. Each spot felt like a page. Each visit, a reading. One late afternoon, he found a narrow jar sealed with wax, tucked beneath a ledge of rock. Inside, a note, perfectly dry. He said he'd wait, and so I wait too. No date, no name. But Elias felt his chest tighten, gently as he read it, not with sadness, with understanding. He added the jar to the altar. From then on, he started writing his own notes, short phrases, questions, small pieces of thought, and placing them in driftwood boxes, in shells, inside the nooks of rocks near the tide. He never saw anyone retrieve them, but he always found new ones in return. You're not the first to listen. The sea knows more than we do. We kept watch, too. The messages were never signed. But Elias recognized the handwriting, not because he'd seen it before, because it felt familiar, in the way light feels familiar on the skin. The shore had become part of the story, not a setting, but a character. It shifted with him, reflected him, offered memory, not as history, but as connection. He began to understand that the shore, like the lighthouse, remembered those who remembered it. It kept stories in the lines of its stones, in the shape of its inlets, in the Oz, salt that rested heavy in the air. The past was not buried. It was etched into the curve of the coastline. And every time he walked it, he read it again. Not with eyes, with presence. One evening, as the sun melted gently into the sea, Elias stood at the edge of the tide. The water touched his boots. The wind was soft. In the distance, a gull cried once, then was silent. He closed his eyes and whispered aloud, "I remember." And the sea, the wind, the shore, they answered not with words, but with stillness, with belonging, with the feeling of a memory returning home. There is a time that lives between, not day, not night, not wakefulness, not sleep. It slips quietly into the world like breath beneath a closed door, unnoticed by most, but deeply known by those who listen. Elias came to call it the hour between. It arrived differently each evening, sometimes just after the sun disappeared, beneath the sea, casting the sky in bruised violet and rose. Other times, just before the stars showed themselves, when the world still held a trace of warmth, but the shadows had begun to lengthen. He first noticed it one evening while seated, near the garden bench, the lantern resting by his side. The sky was neither dark nor light. The wind had quieted. The sea, too, had stilled. Even the birds were silent. And yet, he felt more than ever. The air seemed fuller. The world suspended. He didn't move. He simply sat there and breathed. And in that breath, he felt accompanied, not by form, but by presence. Not by memory, but by meaning. The hour between had arrived. From that moment on, Elias began marking its coming, not by clocks or shadows, but by sensation. The way the grass stopped rustling, the way his own heartbeat seemed to slow. He'd feel it, soft but sure, like the space between inhale and exhale. A pause, a presence. He learned that the hour between wasn't about time. It was a threshold, a moment when the veil between what is seen and what is remembered thins just enough to let them touch. And when that happened, the lighthouse breathed differently. The walls felt warmer. The lantern flickered not with fire, but with invitation. The objects in the room, the stones, the pages, the sea glass, seemed to lean toward him slightly, as if listening. Elias began to treat the hour between as a ritual. He'd make tea and carry it to his favorite chair by the window, where the last light of the day and the first hush of night crossed paths. He wouldn't read. He wouldn't speak. He would sit and open. To stillness, to memory, to presence. One evening, as the hour settled in, he noticed something new. A faint scent in the air. Not smoke, not salt, lavender, just a breath of it drifting past like a forgotten promise. And then, faint footsteps on the stair, soft, measured. He didn't rise. He didn't turn. He only smiled, softly. They were here, as they often were. And in that hour, they did not haunt. They remembered. Alongside him, the hour between was theirs, too. He realized then that this space, this gentle moment, between one world and the next, belonged not just to those who lived, but to those who had been. Those who loved, those who listened, those who left pieces of themselves in footprints and light. Sometimes, in the hour between, he would feel the lighthouse shift, not physically, emotionally, as if the stone and wood and window remembered something at the same time. He would hear a creak, not of wear, but of recognition. He would feel warmth on his shoulder, not from flame, but from affection. And once, just once, he heard a voice, not spoken aloud, but clear. "You are not the end of the story." He whispered back, "I know." The hour passed slowly, like a page being turned in silence. And when it ended, when the stars finally showed, or the darkness deepened, it left no trace. Only the quiet knowing that something sacred had passed through. Elias began to write small phrases inspired by those moments. He called them between thoughts. He never edited them. He didn't read them aloud. He simply let them fall onto the page as they came. The air remembers the shape of voices. Light bends for the ones who watch gently. Stillness is the softest kind of welcome. Not all presence needs to be seen to be real. He tucked them inside the covers of old books around the lighthouse, unsure if anyone would ever read them. That wasn't the point. The hour between didn't require witnesses, only participants, only hearts open enough to sit quietly as the world paused its turning. Over time, the hour became his most cherished part of the day, not for what it gave him, but for what it asked of him. Stillness, breath, trust, and in that sacred space, not quite day, not quite night, Elias felt most like himself. Not the keeper, not the dreamer, not the writer, just the one who listened. And that was enough. The fog came in without warning, not like a storm or a wave, not with thunder or fury. It simply arrived like breath across a mirror, soft, slow, inevitable. Elias had come to understand the patterns of the island, the rhythms of wind and tide, but the fog was different. It obeyed no schedule. It answered to no moon. It moved on memory. He first noticed it one morning when he opened the lighthouse door and the world was gone. The sea, the sky, even the stones that lined the path, all swallowed by a pale, endless hush. There was no horizon, only a soft gray that folded over itself like wool. He stepped outside and listened. The fog made no sound. It didn't even disturb the air. And yet it carried weight, not heavy, but present. It wrapped around his shoulders like a forgotten coat, one that still smelled faintly of those who once wore it. He walked the path toward the garden, though he could barely see beyond his hands. The mist curled through the rosemary, traced the edges of the old bench. Each step felt slower, each breath more deliberate, as if the fog wanted him to remember how to arrive. Later that day, he lit the lantern early. The flame cast a small circle of gold into the white, a miniature, sun held between worlds. He sat near the window, watching the light press against the fog like fingers behind frosted glass. The silence deepened, but it was not empty. It was waiting. That evening, he heard voices, not loud, not close, just beyond the veil. They weren't speaking to him, not directly. They were speaking through fog, through memory, through time. He didn't try to understand the words. He let them pass by like leaves in water. That night, the dreams came differently, not in flashes or visions, but in feeling. He dreamt of a place he had never been, but knew with perfect clarity. A dock, a boat with green paint peeling, a woman's scarf left on a piling, fluttering with wind that never touched his skin. When he woke, the fog was still there. 3 days passed before the light returned, but even when it did, the world had changed. He could no longer look at the trees, the stones, the tide, without seeing their echoes, as if the fog had peeled back a layer of the island. And now he could see what had always been beneath. Footsteps where no feet walked, names in the bark of trees, a warmth near the garden gate, as if someone had stood there just moments ago. The fog had not hidden the world. It had revealed it. From then on, when the fog came, Elias did not wait for it to pass. He welcomed it. He opened the windows, let it roll in like a tide. He walked the halls slowly, letting it fill the corners of the rooms, allowing the house to soften into its memory. He whispered greetings into the stillness, not expecting replies, but sometimes they came. A creak on the stair, the soft thump of a book falling from a shelf with no wind to blame, a candle flickering once, and then still. One evening, he followed the fog, down the path, past the garden, through the hollow trees that lined the western edge of the island. It guided him gently, never pushing, just offering. He reached a clearing he had never noticed before. There, in the mist, stood a small stone marker. Weathered, cracked. He knelt beside it, brushing away moss and lichen. No name, just a symbol. A spiral surrounded by 4 stars. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear, with recognition. The same spiral etched into the sea glass. The same 4 stars drawn in the margins of a page he once found in the attic. The fog thickened, and then cleared. For a moment, the world shimmered. He saw a woman standing at the edge of the clearing. She wore a blue shawl. Her eyes were kind, though filled with years. She did not speak. She only nodded, once, slowly, and vanished like breath returning to the sea. He stood there a long time. When he finally returned to the lighthouse, he lit the lantern and placed it by the window. And he whispered, "Thank you for showing me." The fog returned many times after that, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for days. He no longer feared its arrival. It was not a thing to escape, but a presence to welcome. The fog had become a doorway, a pause in time, a soft reminder that the world was more than what could be seen. It was what could be felt, remembered, shared. He left gifts for it, a pebble from the garden, a folded page of writing, a thread from his coat. He imagined the fog carrying them into another time, another hand, another watcher sitting by another window. Perhaps somewhere, another keeper lit their lantern and smiled into the white. Perhaps in that silence, they too listened. Perhaps the fog connected them, not by path, by presence. And so Elias waited gently for its return, not for what it might bring, but for what it allowed him to. The letters began as thoughts he never meant to keep. At first, Elias wrote them without purpose, lines scribbled in the margins of his journal, on the backs of old paper bags, on scraps torn from the boxes that once held candles or dried tea. He didn't call them letters then. They were just thoughts with shape, whispers that stayed when the world was quiet. But they grew, not louder, only longer, not more urgent, only more patient. They arrived like the sea's hush at low, tide, present, waiting, unafraid to be still. He wrote them at night, when the lighthouse had grown quiet and the world outside softened into mist. Sometimes by the glow of the lantern, sometimes by the last touch of moonlight. He didn't write to anyone in particular, or perhaps he did, to the past, to the forgotten, to the versions of himself that had once stood in places now gone. You would have loved the way the wind sounds through the hollow trees. I think I understand now what stillness wants. There's a softness in the silence here I never knew I needed. Each letter was like a breath he had held for too long. And when he wrote, it was as if something within him exhaled fully, without fear of vanishing. He folded them gently, without sealing them, stacked them in a wooden box he found beneath the floorboards, the same box once used to store sailors' tools. He lined the inside with velvet from an old coat and let the pages rest as if asleep. He didn't number them. He didn't categorize. He let them accumulate like leaves, soft and scattered, but always returning in season. He never planned to send them, but he treated each one like a message delivered all the same. Some letters were a single sentence. Others stretched for pages. I remember the way your hands moved when you made tea. I still try to copy it, but the sound is never the same. I wonder if the water here remembers the rhythm. He wrote letters to the ocean, to the fog, to the room where the rocking chair waited in the corner, to the child whose footprints had once appeared on the path, to the silence that arrived just before rain, to the wind that sometimes knocked once on the window, then vanished. He wrote to the future, to ghosts he hoped were listening. He wrote to silence, "Thank you for never rushing me." Sometimes he wrote without words, Lines of shapes, loops, stars, gentle curves, and circles. Symbols he didn't understand, but felt he should remember. Once, he traced the spiral he had seen etched in the stone near the garden over and over until the page looked like a seashell spun into ink. He didn't seek answers in these letters. He sought remembrance. And in that act, something began. To answer back, not in voice or mail, but in feeling. One night, he left one of the letters by the door, folded neatly. No name, no direction. By morning, it was gone. The wind had not been strong. The tide hadn't risen. And yet, only a smooth stone remained in its place. Round, dark, warm to the touch, as if held by another hand just moments before. He smiled and whispered, "Message received." From then on, he began releasing the letters one by one. Some he tucked into the gaps between the lighthouse walls. Others he placed inside bottles and let the tide carry them into whatever current chose to claim them. A few he burned, not to destroy them, but to let their words rise like breath into the night, curling skyward, joining the wind that carried the lighthouse's voice to distant shores. Each letter sent felt like a sigh released after years of being held, and in return, the world answered softly, not in speech, but in echoes. A seashell washed ashore with ink still clinging to it, a pressed flower tucked inside an old journal he was certain he had never opened before, a note written in unfamiliar hand tucked into his coat pocket, simply reading, "We hear you." He read his letters aloud sometimes, not for himself, but for those who might be listening. The stone walls, the sea-worn beams, the mist curling through the windows. They listened without judgment, without reply. And yet he felt heard. One letter he addressed to the future. If you ever find this place, and it feels familiar, it's because you were remembered here, even before you arrived, especially before. He folded that one slowly and placed it in the pages of his favorite book on the shelf. It was a promise, tucked among quiet words. Not all letters needed to be read. Some were meant only to be written. Some were meant to be felt. Some were messages the heart gave to the world without needing to know where they landed. In time, the act of writing became its own kind of breath. Each letter a heartbeat. Each page a step across a bridge between what was and what might still be. Elias no longer wrote to be known. He wrote to remember, to release, to reach gently toward what could no longer be touched. The lighthouse remembered with him. Its walls held his words like the shore held footprints, briefly, softly, before returning them to the sea. There were no mailboxes, no stamps, number, addresses, but the letters always found their way. They settled into corners of wind, folded themselves into the grain of floorboards, whispered from one tide pool to the next. And though he never knew where they ended up, he always felt when they arrived. He started leaving pens in small jars around the house, as if others might want to write too, as if they already had. That night, as he sat beside the lantern, he wrote the longest letter yet. It began not with "dear," but with a breath. It ended not with "sincerely," but with a silence that felt whole. He folded it, held it to his chest, then opened the door and let the wind decide. It began with stillness, not silence, stillness, the kind of stillness that settles over the sea when the wind forgets to breathe, and even the clouds hang, motionless like paintings held in the sky. Elias had seen calm seas before, but this was different. This was waiting. He noticed it one morning, standing at the edge of the lighthouse steps. The tide had receded, leaving a wide, flat sheet of wet sand behind, smooth as polished glass. And upon it, the world reflected perfectly. Sky mirrored sky. Clouds mirrored clouds. Even Elias saw himself, distant, rippling slightly, as though he were both above and below. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to disturb the illusion, but it held. With each footstep, he felt as though he were walking between two worlds. One above, one below, each identical but separate. The mirror tide had come. He had no name for it at first. It wasn't listed in any journal or almanac. It didn't follow the moon's rhythm or the predictable pull of gravity. It simply arrived, once, twice, maybe 3 times a season, never announced, never explained, only witnessed. He began to mark it in his own way. On a page in the chi, back of his notebook, he would draw a single horizontal line each time it returned. No words, no dates, just a line. One for the sea, one for the sky. The mirror tide turned the world quiet. Not just around him, inside him. His thoughts moved slower, his breath deeper. Even the sound of his heartbeat seemed to stretch. He'd walk for hours across the mirrored shore, not caring where he went, because the destination was never the point. It was the reflection. Sometimes the mirror would show things he didn't expect. Not himself, not exactly, but versions of himself, younger, older, braver, quieter. Once, he saw himself standing still while the reflection moved, slowly, lifting a hand as if in farewell. Another time, he saw no reflection at all. Only the stars where his shadow should be. He didn't question it. The mirror tide was not about logic. It was about permission. Permission to see what lay beneath. Not just water, but memory. One morning, he brought a chair and a cup of tea to the edge of the tide and simply sat. The steam rose gently, mirrored below him like a whisper repeating itself. He watched the light shift across the sand and imagined what it would be like to step fully into the mirrored world. Would it feel colder? Would his voice echo upward instead of outward? Would time pass in reverse? Or would it simply hold him, exactly as he was, without demand or expectation? He wrote fewer words on mirror tide days. Not because he had less to say, but because the tide said it for him. Each ripple, each shimmer, each breath between the waves. He noticed how birds avoided the shore when the mirror rose. How the breeze, if it came at all, only curled gently at the edges, as if nature too was watching itself. He once left a stone at the center of the mirror, not tossed, not thrown, placed. The ripples radiated outward in perfect symmetry, and for a moment the reflection fractured into 100 pieces before mending itself as if nothing had ever touched it. But Elias had touched it, and it had remembered. That night, he dreamed he was walking beneath the sea, though his feet were dry. Above him, the sky floated gently, full of stars that pulsed like slow heartbeats. He reached up and touched the surface, and it rippled not outward, but inward. He woke with tears on his cheeks, not of sadness, of recognition. The mirror tide didn't just show the world, it showed the self behind the noise, the self beneath the rolls, the self that watched, waited, and remembered. He came to believe the tide arrived when it was needed most, not when the sea was calm, when he was ready. He stopped trying to record it. He stopped bringing clocks or cameras or notebooks. He simply walked or stood or sat. And when the mirror vanished, as it always did, he let it go without trying to hold it. One day, the mirror stayed longer, from dawn until well past dusk. And in that time, he spoke softly aloud, not to the sea, but to the reflection. He told it everything, not confessions, not secrets, just truths. I miss things I've never touched. I remember things that never happened. I think I've been here before. In a dream I forgot how to wake from. The reflection said nothing, but the sea did not pull away. It stayed, and so did he. At twilight, when the first stars appeared, and the mirror finally began to blur, Elias whispered one last sentence. "Thank you for showing me. I'm still here." Then he turned back toward the lighthouse. Behind him, the tide rose quietly. The mirror faded. The world returned to its usual shape. But something in him remained changed, not altered, only realized. From then on, he carried a small piece of mirror in his pocket. Not glass, but polished shell, found on the shore the morning after. Whenever the world felt too heavy, he would hold it in his palm and remember. There is always a tide beneath the tide, a reflection beneath the reflection. And sometimes, when the world holds its breath long enough, we are lucky enough to see it. It started as a shadow, a shape that didn't belong to any object, a darkness that fell across the stone floor in late afternoon light, one that had no source. Elias first noticed it while dusting the old shelves in the attic, the soft light from the window falling across his shoulder. The shadow moved slightly, as if breathing, but nothing in the room had shifted. He stood still, eyes scanning the space. No breeze, no movement, no sound, but the shadow remained. And as the light faded, it disappeared, not slowly, but instantly, like something deciding it no longer wanted to be seen. He returned the next day, at the same hour, and it was there again, the exact same shape, not cast by anything, just there. For days he observed it, made no sound, changed nothing. He didn't try to touch it or chase it. He only watched. And one evening he stepped across it, not through, not into, just over. And for a moment the attic changed. The smell shifted from wood and dust to salt and lavender. The air grew warmer, as though someone had just walked through and left the door open behind them. And there, in the far corner of the room where boxes had always been stacked, was a doorway. Not a real one. There was no door, no frame, no threshold. Just ... space. An outline of light where a wall should have been. He walked toward it slowly, heart not pounding, but pausing. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt remembered, as if he had once passed through it and forgotten until now. On the other side, the world looked like the attic. The same beams, the same dust, the same books on the shelf. But the light was different, dimmer, bluer, like twilight held too long. He stepped through and entered the room with no door. Inside, the air was still, thicker somehow, but not suffocating. Books lined the walls, not dusty, but clean. Titles he didn't recognize, languages he couldn't read. And a table at the center, round, made of driftwood, polished smooth by time. On it, a single candle, unlit. He sat. He didn't ask why. He simply sat. As he did, the candle lit, without match, without spark, and the room exhaled. The walls grew wider, the ceiling taller, but only on the inside. From outside, the attic remained unchanged. He knew because he checked. Each time he left, he'd mark the wall with chalk, just a small X. When he returned, the mark was still there, but the room inside grew larger each time. One day, there were windows. Another, a staircase leading nowhere. Eventually, he stopped questioning its shape. The room became a companion. It listened. It held. It shifted with him. Some days, it was filled with music, soft notes played by instruments that had no source. Other days, it smelled of pine or rain or old parchment. He once found a coat draped over a chair, not his, but familiar. He kept no journal of what happened in the room, not out of secrecy, out of respect. It felt like a space not meant to be described, only experienced. Still, he spoke aloud inside. It told stories, read old letters, shared dreams. And sometimes he said nothing at all, just sat with the candle flickering, letting the stillness gather like fog around his feet. Once he fell asleep there and dreamed of another lighthouse on another shore, with another keeper who also walked into a room with no door, and inside that room found Elias. They nodded to each other, then turned and watched the sea. When he woke, the candle was gone. In its place, a small seashell. He kept it in his pocket, always, not for proof, for presence. He came to understand that the room was not a room at all. It was a memory, made into space, a feeling given walls, a part of himself he had not yet entered until now, and it had waited for him with patience only time could offer. The room with no door never locked. It never vanished. It simply waited, just behind the shadow cast by something not quite there. Some nights, he wondered if the lighthouse itself had rooms like this, ones the eye couldn't see, but the heart could enter. He began to notice other spaces, a hallway that felt longer than it was, a step on the stairs that always sounded hollow, a part of the garden that bloomed even out of season. He no longer feared what couldn't be explained. Not all truths needed names. Some only needed time, and breath, and trust. He visited the room with no door every week, sometimes to speak, sometimes to listen, sometimes just to be. And every time he left, it remained behind, exactly where it had always been, not in the attic, in him. Before Elias, the lighthouse had another keeper. He never met him, never saw his face, but he felt him in the walls. Not as a ghost, exactly, more like a presence that lingered in the corners where the dust never settled, in the way certain floorboards creaked only when the wind blew west, in the way the kettle always whistled a few seconds before it should. There were signs. The handwriting in the margins of the old maintenance logbook, careful, curved, almost tender. The repairs made with care, not for efficiency, but for longevity. Ropes knotted with old sailors' skill. Hinges oiled even when they didn't squeak. And then there were the things left behind. A pipe carved from bone. A coat stitched at the cuffs with thread that shimmered blue in the morning light. A music box tucked inside the drawer of a desk. It played a tune Elias didn't know, but felt he had once heard in a dream. The keeper before had lived here. Not just stayed. Lived, loved, listened. Elias began to wonder what his name had been. But no plaque bore it. No journal began with I am. Only scattered signs, like breadcrumbs dropped through time, leading not toward identity, but intimacy. He began to feel less alone. He imagined the other keepers sitting in the same chair, reading the same books, looking out at the same sea, hearing the same gull cry that echoed off the cliffs. They had shared the same silence. And silence, Elias had come to believe, was one of the deepest forms of connection. One day, while cleaning out the far end of the attic, Elias found a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were folded pages, yellowed by time, written in ink faded to smoke. They were letters, but none addressed, none signed. Just thoughts, memories, reflections, much like the ones Elias had begun to write himself. In one, the keeper described a dream of climbing the lighthouse stairs, only to find the top room gone, replaced by a vast sky full of stars he didn't recognize. In another, he spoke of a bird that visited every morning, tapping twice on the kitchen window, as if checking in. Another letter reads simply, "The wind told me today that this place remembers more than I do. I believe it." Elias sat with those pages for hours, not reading, but listening. And when he folded them again, he whispered, "I hear you." From then on, he thought of the keeper not as a stranger, but as a companion passed through time. A voice he could no longer hear, but still felt harmonizing with his own. He imagined what the other keeper had carried here, not in his hands, but in his heart. Regrets? Hopes? Names whispered only to the sea? Elias began to mirror him in small ways. He repaired the coat's loose buttons. He refilled the oil lamp left on the attic shelf. He wound the music box every Sunday, letting its notes drift through the lighthouse like the scent of something warm and distant. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, he'd feel a warmth behind him, like someone had just stood there, watching the sea with him. Not haunting, holding. On a fog-heavy morning, Elias climbed to the lantern room and found, etched in a glass, a single word, still. He hadn't noticed it before. Perhaps it had always been there. Perhaps it had waited for him to be quiet enough to see it. He traced the letters with his finger and understood. Still here, still listening, still keeping the light. He realized then that lighthouse keeping was never a solitary act. It was a relay, a handing of quiet between souls. The keeper before had passed the silence to Elias, and Elias would pass it onward, someday, in some way, not by leaving his name behind, but by leaving his care, his breath in the walls, his echo in the stair. He began writing his own letters. Again, but now some were addressed to the keeper after me. In them, he described the wind's behavior in March, the way the sea glass turned violet in late summer, which floorboard to step over in the hallway on rainy days. And more than that, he shared feelings. If you feel alone, know that I did too sometimes. But the sea always listened. And eventually, I did too. He tucked them into a drawer beneath the desk, left the key on the windowsill, and lit the lantern every night, not for the ships, for the keeper who might one day find their way here. He hoped they would feel what he had felt. Not a house, a home, not a job, a vow to keep the light, to hold the quiet, to remember, to be still. Elias first noticed the window on a morning wrapped in fog. He had passed that wall 100 times. It stood along the back corridor, facing inland, where only tall grass and tangled trees stretched for miles. The wall had always been blank, aged plaster, faint cracks like veins beneath old paint. But today, a window was there, perfectly framed, clean, closed, and unfamiliar. He stopped, unsure if it had always been there, hidden in plain sight, or if it had arrived quietly during the night, like the fog that now pressed against every pane of the lighthouse. The glass looked old, rippled at the edges, the kind found in places that remembered more than they revealed. It was cold to the touch, not unpleasantly so, but like a hand you didn't know you missed until it held yours. Beyond the window was nothing, not a void, not blackness, just nowhere, no trees, no sky, no movement, only a soft, infinite gray that felt more like a silence than a color. He stood before it for a long time, watching, waiting for something to appear, a bird, a branch, even his own reflection. But the window gave back nothing, and somehow that absence felt intimate. He tried to open it. The latch moved easily. The glass lifted with no resistance. But still, no air moved through. No scent, no breeze. Just the same still gray, now open to his breath. He closed it gently. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't. Write it down. The window didn't ask for attention. It asked for presence. He began to visit it each morning, sometimes with tea, sometimes with nothing. And each time he looked through and saw exactly the same soft, endless nowhere. It became his mirror, not of his face, of his stillness. He noticed how his thoughts slowed in its presence, how the ache in his shoulders eased, how the questions he carried lost their sharp edges. The window asked for nothing, and in return gave him the same: freedom from need, from story, from time. He tried to map it once, measured the wall from inside and out, took steps along the outer stone, looked from the garden, the path, even climbed a ladder to see from above. But from the outside, the window didn't exist. Just stone and ivy and silence. It existed only from within. One day, he placed a chair before it, sat for hours, didn't blink, didn't speak, felt the weight of years shift gently in his chest, like books being returned to a shelf in perfect order. He whispered aloud, "Where do you lead?" And the window remained unchanged, but in his heart, something answered. Here, not a place, a presence, a pause, a being. He wrote a single line that evening. The window that shows me nowhere is where I finally am. It became a ritual. He left a small lantern by the windowsill, unlit. Each night, he lit it for just a moment, not to illuminate, to honor, and then blew it out, letting the smoke drift toward the pane. One night, as he sat there in silence, he noticed something different. The gray beyond the window moved, not like wind, like breath, a slow, steady rise and fall, as if the space itself had lungs. He leaned closer. He didn't see a shape, but he felt one, and he knew then. The window didn't face nowhere. It faced within. It was not a view. It was an invitation to meet himself where words did not live, to sit with the parts of him he never brought into the light, regrets, longings, love he hadn't known how to name. The window showed him none of it, but it let him feel it all. One day, the fog never lifted. Not outside, inside. He woke, walked the corridor, and the window was gone. No frame, no glass, only blank wall. Unmarked, silent. He didn't panic, didn't try to find it, didn't try to understand. He only whispered, "Thank you," and placed his hand where the window had been. The wall was warm, not from sun, from memory, from return, from grace. He walked away lighter, not because he had seen something, because he had allowed himself to be seen. Nowhere had shown him everything, and he carried it quietly, like a window in his chest that only opened when he remembered to be. The lantern had always been there. From the first moment Elias stepped inside the lighthouse, he noticed it, resting on a small wooden shelf just beside the stairs. It was simple in design, brass, a little tarnished. The glass was thick, warped slightly, like it had been shaped by hand and time together. Inside was a wick, clean and unused, and yet it gave off a gentle, steady glow. He hadn't lit it, no one had, and still it burned, not brightly, just enough to cast a soft golden circle that never flickered, never faded. At first, he thought it was an illusion, a trick of sunlight or some internal wiring. He searched for batteries, wires, anything to explain it, but there were none. The lantern was just that, a lantern, and it never went out. Days passed, then weeks. Storms came, winds howled, and power lines failed, but the lantern remained the same, unchanged, steady. He moved around it at first, respectfully cautious. It felt sacred somehow, not magical sacred, like something that remembered when it had last been touched and honored the stillness in between. Sometimes he sat near it, simply to read, sometimes to think, more often just to breathe. It gave him the kind of light you didn't notice until you missed it, the kind that didn't demand attention, but made everything around it feel softer. He began to understand that the lantern was more than light. It was presence. He never tried to move it, never polished it or cleaned the glass. It didn't ask for care. It was care, existing gently, faithfully, without expectation. Over time, he began to speak near it. Not prayers, not questions, just thoughts. released like dandelion seeds. I'm tired today. I miss the sea, even when I'm beside it. I dreamed of someone whose name I never knew. The lantern never answered, but it never turned away. And that was enough. There was a comfort in its silence. In a world that asked so often for performance, it asked only for presence. Some nights, Elias dreamt of it, not as an object, but as a companion, a quiet watcher seated beside him in the dark. Sometimes it took the form of a person with eyes like amber. Other times, just the feeling of warmth in his hands, even when they were empty. One morning, he found a small note folded beneath it. No handwriting, no signature, just a single word, continue. He didn't know how. It got there. He didn't ask. He just nodded, whispered, "Thank you," and tucked it into his pocket. After that, he began to trust the lantern more, not as something mysterious, but as something constant. When his thoughts tangled, he sat beside it. When the days felt hollow, he stood in its glow. When the fog crept in thick enough to hide even the sea, he held the lantern's presence like a promise in his palm. It reminded him that not all light was meant to guide. Some was meant to accompany. One day, a traveler came to the lighthouse. Lost, soaked in salt and fear. They didn't speak much. They only said, "I saw the light." I didn't know where I was going, but it felt like it was waiting for me. Elias led them inside, sat them near the lantern, watched as their breath slowed. Their shoulders eased. They left the next morning, quieter than before, but steadier. And as they turned down the path, Elias noticed they carried something. In their hand, not the lantern, but a warmth shaped like it, glowing faintly, fading slowly. The lantern still sat in its place, still glowing, still patient. He began to believe it gave a piece of its light to those who needed it, and refilled itself from the quiet. He stopped thinking of it as an object at all. It was more like a memory that never dimmed, a kindness made visible. One evening, during a particularly long and restless night, Elias sat beside it and asked, "Will you ever go out?" The lantern did not flicker, did not respond, but something in him felt answered, not with a promise of eternal flame, with a reminder, light like this does not end. It continues in what it touches, in silence, in care, in being seen. He thought of all the moments in his life where someone had stayed quietly, without demand, where light had found him in unlit places. The lantern was all of those things, and now it was his turn to be that for others. He never named it, never tried to define it, but he knew, without question, that it was real. It had always been there, not just on the shelf, in him, waiting, burning softly, without smoke, without need. And when he passed by it each morning, he always said the same words, "I see you." And though it never replied, he always felt the same warmth in return. Still here, still burning, still waiting, for whoever would need it next. The spiral staircase had always creaked on the 7th step. Elias noticed it on his first day in the lighthouse. A soft, drawn-out sound, not a complaint, but more like a breath, as if the stair itself exhaled whenever it was stepped on. Over time, he grew used to it. It became a part of the lighthouse's rhythm, like the wind through the beams or the quiet drip of rain from the eaves. He never questioned it until the day the creak didn't come. It was early morning before. The sky had shifted from indigo to gray. Elias was climbing the stairs with a cup of tea, half asleep, when he passed the 7th step and heard nothing. No sound, no sigh, just silence. He stopped and stepped back. Nothing. He bent down, touched the step, cool, dry. Then, as his hand brushed along the edge, he felt it, a seam. A narrow gap along the stair's base, almost invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to touch. A subtle line, like something meant to be hidden in plain sight. His curiosity stirred gently, like fog lifting off the sea. He set the cup down and pressed against the stair. At first, nothing happened. Then, with the lightest pressure, the tread tilted backward, just enough to reveal a hollow beneath. A small, dark space beneath the spiral stair. It smelled of wood and salt and something else. Age, perhaps, or memory. Inside was a box, simple, square, made of driftwood smoothed by time. He lifted it out slowly, carefully, like waking something that had been dreaming for years. There was no lock, only a loop of worn string tied around a small carved shell. He opened it. Inside were objects, carefully placed and wrapped in cloth so soft it nearly disintegrated in his hands. A brass key, cold to the touch, with no teeth. A feather, long and silver gray, too large to belong to any bird he'd seen. A stone, black and smooth, etched with a spiral. A small notebook, its pages yellowed, its cover wrapped in sea-green leather. He opened it. The writing inside was sparse, scattered, written in a hand unlike any he'd found elsewhere in the lighthouse. Short phrases, observations, reflections. It watches when the tide is lowest. Dreamed of a door that doesn't open, but lets you through anyway. Today, the lantern sang. I understood nothing and everything at once. Some entries were dates, some were not. Others were symbols, repeated spirals, wave-like lines, stars with too many points. There was no name, no signature, only the quiet sense that these words were not meant to instruct, but to accompany. Elias read every page, slowly, with care, and when he finished, he didn't feel he had learned something. He felt he had remembered something he didn't know he had forgotten. He replaced each item in the box, except the spiral stone. That he held in his palm and sat beside the stair, breathing with it, as if it carried its own tide. The creak never returned, but each time he stepped on the seventh stair, he felt a gentle warmth rise from beneath, as though the space below had been acknowledged, and in return, acknowledged him. He began to notice other things, how shadows curved differently beneath the stair when the moon was high, how the wind paused there for just a second longer than anywhere else in the lighthouse, how sometimes, when he passed that step, his thoughts would quiet, not silenced, but soothed. He placed a small candle on the landing beside the seventh stair, never lit it. It didn't need to burn. It was there as a marker, a sign of presence. He started adding to the notebook, not over the old words, beside them. New reflections. There's a stillness beneath the spiral that holds something more than air. I think it's listening. Or maybe I finally am. He didn't write every day, only when something in him whispered. And each time he placed the notebook back. In the box, he tied the string around the shell with quiet hands. He didn't share the discovery, not because it was secret, because it was sacred. A space beneath the stair that held silence not as absence, but as offering. He once dreamed he descended a stair that spiraled endlessly downward, not into darkness, but into light so soft it hummed. At the bottom, he found nothing, and in that nothing, everything. He woke with tears that didn't ache, only released. He carved a small spiral into the edge of the seventh stair, not to claim it, to thank it. The box remained beneath, waiting always, asking nothing, offering only stillness. He began to think of the stair as a doorway, not into a room, into a moment that remembered, that softened, that held. And whenever he felt lost, he placed his hand on the stair and whispered, I'm still here. And from below, something quiet answered, So am I the garden behind thee. Lighthouse had never bloomed in winter. Elias had accepted this as truth. Flowers, like people, needed warmth. They needed sun, soil that yielded softly to their roots, air that carried scents instead of frost. So when the days shortened and the wind changed its voice, the garden always fell still. Stalks withered, leaves curled, earth hardened. It was a season of pause. Until one morning, it wasn't. Elias stepped outside before dawn, the air cold enough to numb breath, the sky still holding stars not yet chased by light. He walked the path out of habit, not expecting anything new, only silence and frost. And then he saw it. A single bloom, small, pale violet, curled gently toward the sky like it had just woken from the longest sleep. It stood alone in the center of the garden. No stem around it stirred, no leaves, no hint of green. Just that flower, alive, breathing, dreaming. He knelt beside it, careful not to disturb the frost that cradled its base. He didn't touch it, only watched. Its petals shimmered slightly, not with dew, but with something softer, like sleep, clinging to the edges of waking. He whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." But the flower stayed. He returned each day, sometimes with tea, sometimes with questions. It never changed, never grew, never wilted, only existed, perfectly, peacefully. It began to feel like the garden was dreaming, and the flower was its thought, rising gently to the surface of frozen soil. He began to notice things, subtle changes. The air felt warmer near the bloom. The wind calmed as it passed. And sometimes, if he sat still long enough, he thought he heard humming, soft, slow, not from any throat or string, but from the ground itself. He told no one, but he began to write. A journal, small and leather-bound, left near the bloom each evening and retrieved each morning. Inside, observations, moments, whispers. Tonight, the frost seemed to bow as it landed. I dreamed of warmth that came not from fire, but from memory. The flower is still here. I think it's listening. Then came the second bloom. Weeks later, beside the first, larger, white with a faint blush of lavender at the tips. They never touched, but the space between them felt intentional, like breath held between verses of a lullaby. The garden began to change, not with color, with feeling. It no longer felt asleep. It felt paused, intentionally, consciously, like something, choosing to wait rather than forced to stillness. Snow fell, and it never covered the blooms. The wind came, but it never broke their stems. He built a small bench nearby, not to watch, to share. He sat for hours without need for understanding. Sometimes he brought books and read aloud. Other times, he simply closed his eyes and let the silence settle around him like a familiar coat. Once, he fell asleep beside the garden. When he woke, the sky was dark, and the flowers glowed, softly, like moonlight pulled inward. He whispered, "Are you dreaming me too?" The answer came in warmth against his hand. A third bloom had arrived. He wept then, quietly, not for sadness, for being known. The journal filled. Its pages no longer observed, they conversed. He stopped asking why and started saying, "Thank you." One entry read, "Winter is not the absence of growth. It is the shape of reflection." The blooms never multiplied quickly. Only when something in him shifted, he began to feel they weren't flowers. They were moments of peace, of surrender, of gentleness, made visible, held without condition. By the end of the season, there were 5, each one a different color, each one untouched by time. And on the final day of winter, he woke to find the bench covered in frost, except where he sat. There, a single bloom had grown into the wood, its its stem disappearing into the grain, its petals folded like hands in rest. Spring arrived. The rest of the garden stirred. Green returned. Life burst forth in wild color. But the 5 blooms remained unchanged, unmoving, unaging. He tended the rest of the garden with care. But the dreaming blooms he left, untouched. He no longer called it the winter garden. He called it the dreaming place. And when visitors asked what it meant, he only smiled and said, "Some flowers don't grow from seeds. They grow from remembering." There was a creak in the floorboards beneath Elias's bed. It wasn't unusual old wood, always remembered its own weight. But this creak was different. It came not when he moved, but when he lay still. Not from pressure, but from stillness. As if the floor shifted only to acknowledge presence. One night, the sound deepened, a low, hollow resonance. He lit a candle and stepped down, expecting to find warped planks or damp seams. But the wood was dry, untouched, yet beneath one board, something felt open. He pressed gently. It lifted. Beneath it, not dust, not stone, just air. He reached for a lantern, hesitated, then looked again. A void, but not dark. Light. Soft blue. Not electric, not reflected. It shimmered like dawn held its breath just beneath his room. Elias widened the opening. The glow deepened. Not brighter, fuller. Like the sky had folded inward and taken shelter beneath his floor. He dropped a stone. No sound, no bottom, only light. He stared into it for minutes, then hours. The night passed without sleep. He dreamed anyway, of falling, of flying, of being held by clouds made of memory. In the morning, the opening remained. He left it uncovered. It didn't change the air, didn't chill the room. It just was. He started sitting beside it each evening, speaking not into it, but beside it, as though it were a guest at the table. "I used to dream of the sky as escape," he once whispered. "Now it feels like home." The light responded only in presence, never flickering, never pulsing, only there. Some days he leaned in, felt warmth on his cheek. Other times, coolness like sea wind at dusk. Once he dropped a feather. Into it, it didn't fall. It vanished, soundlessly, softly as though being received. He began to believe it was not a hole. It was a window, not looking down, looking in. The sky beneath the floor did not reflect the one above. It had no stars, no sun, no cloud, just light. Alive, without shape. A sky that existed not to be seen, but to be felt. He stopped trying to understand. Understanding asked for answers. Feeling asked for presence. He chose presence. Visitors never saw the opening, even those who stood in the room. Their feet passed over it without pause. Only those who listened could feel the shift. The hum beneath the boards. A low note, like a cello buried in the earth, playing not music, but memory. One night, as he sat alone, the light grew dimmer, not fading, resting. He lay beside it, hand outstretched, and said, "It's okay. I'm still here." And with those words, it returned to full. The floor sang gently beneath him. He didn't know what it was, only what it became. A part of him, a reflection without form. A sky not of stars, but of silence. He began leaving small notes at the edge. "I forgive you. I am learning to rest. You are not lost." Each morning they were gone, not stolen, accepted. Once he asked aloud, "What are you?" And the only answer was warmth in his chest. Enough. That was enough. He knew now that the lighthouse did not sit on stone alone. It rested on memory, on stillness, on sky hidden where no one looked. Not above, within. And when he walked across that floor each morning, he stepped lightly, not out of fear, out of reverence. The lighthouse stood in its stillness, bathed in the soft hues of dusk. The sea stretched endlessly, its surface calm, like breath held between heartbeats. Wind moved gently across the stone, carrying with it the faintest scent of salt, old wood, and lavender from the garden that no longer obeyed seasons. Inside, everything hummed with quiet. Elias walked slowly through the rooms, his steps unhurried, deliberate. Each wall held the echo of his time here. Not loud, not desperate, just there, present, kind. A whisper woven into stone and wood and silence. He paused in the kitchen, where the old kettle sat unused but clean, where the sun once fell through the window just right. He placed his hand on the table and let it rest there, feeling the cool grain of the wood and remembering mornings without words. Only tea and the sound of gulls. Then through the corridor, where the light slanted in long ribbons across the floor, where the seventh stair still waited. He stepped on it as he had 1,000 times. It didn't creak anymore. It breathed. A breath beneath the spiral. A keeper beneath the step. He bent down, not to open it again, but to place his hand upon it. A farewell that did not close, only paused. He continued, lantern in hand, not the one that had never gone out, but another, unlit, simple. He carried it not for light, but for presence, a gesture, a ritual, something known by those who had come before and those who would someday come after. Outside, the fog rolled gently across the cliffs, not heavy, not hiding, just soft, a blanket for the end of day. The sea moved slowly, like something deep within it had grown tired and was ready to sleep. Elias stood at the edge of the stone path, where sea met air in a horizonless blend, where sky lowered itself to rest beside water, and neither asked the other to be more than what it was. He looked upward, not in search, not in acknowledgement. The stars would return soon. They always did. Patient, watchful, unchanged. He thought of the window that faced nowhere, the sky beneath the floor, the music box that played songs made only of memory, the flowers that bloomed in winter without need of spring, the silence that listened louder than any voice, the notes he had written and tucked away beneath steps, in drawers, between stones. He thought of the other keeper, the one who had come before, and the one who would come next, because there would always be another. Someone else would find the kettle. The seventh stair, the garden. The lantern. And in time, they would find the quiet. And no, he did not take the spiral stone with him. He left it on the WINDOWSILL. Alongside the key with no teeth and the feather that never belonged to any bird. He didn't need them anymore. They had done what they were meant to do. They had helped him remember who he was. When no one was looking, the lighthouse didn't need to remember his name, only that someone had been kind. Here. Present. Still. He opened the door to the lantern room one last time. The lens turned. Light cast across the sea in slow, even rhythm. And he smiled, because the light wasn't his. It never had been. He had only kept it warm. He stepped outside. The night met him, gently. Not as ending. As returning. The wind brushed his coat. The garden shimmered faintly behind him, even. In darkness. The tower rose at his back, tall, patient, breathing. He took a final breath, not deep, natural. The kind taken when there's nothing left to ask. He whispered, I was here. Not for anyone to hear. Only for the place itself. And the lighthouse whispered back, not in words, but in warmth against his back. Then he walked slowly, past the gate, along the path, into the fog. Not gone. Given. To time. To memory. To stillness. Behind him, the light continued. Turning. Softly. Faithfully. for whomever would come next.